Calmness is one of the most misunderstood forms of power. People talk about it as if it were softness, as if a man who does not raise his voice has somehow surrendered his ground before the argument even begins. That is one of the oldest mistakes arrogant people make. They think silence means uncertainty. They think restraint means dependency. They think a person who is not visibly fighting must not understand the game being played against him. What they do not understand is that some men are calm not because they are defeated, but because they have already begun seeing the whole structure more clearly than the person trying to manipulate them. And once a man reaches that point, the loudest thing he can do is often the least effective. Real leverage does not always come from reaction. Sometimes it comes from letting the truth finish arranging itself before you touch it. That is what I learned at the end of my marriage, though I had to learn it at a cost I would not wish on anyone. For most of my adult life, I believed being steady was enough. I thought if I carried responsibility well, spoke plainly, and refused to turn private pain into public theater, then the people closest to me would eventually understand the value of that. That was one of my blind spots. Another was worse because it sounded honorable. I believed that because I was hard to provoke, I was also hard to manipulate. In reality, calm men are often very easy to manipulate in the beginning, because the kind of people who depend on emotional advantage mistake our discipline for passivity. They start experimenting with disrespect long before they realize they are dealing with someone who notices far more than he says. By the time they understand the difference, they are usually standing inside the consequences of their own assumptions. My name is Thomas Reed. I am 49 years old, and until about 18 months ago I had been married for 16 years to a woman named Celia. We lived outside Charlotte, in a neighborhood of stone-front houses and carefully moderated ambition, the kind of place where the driveways were full enough, the schools were good enough, and the marriages looked composed enough that nobody felt much obligation to ask whether anyone inside them was actually at peace. We had one daughter in college and a son in his junior year of high school. I worked in financial operations for a regional healthcare supplier, which meant audits, vendor risk, forecasting, payment controls, and the endless quiet labor required to keep more visible people from creating expensive surprises with their optimism. I liked that work because it rewarded sequence. It cared very little how intelligent someone sounded in a meeting if the numbers beneath the story were weak. I trusted that world because it punished fantasy eventually. At home, I was slower than I should have been to trust what sequence was telling me. Celia worked in community partnerships for an arts and education nonprofit. She was bright, charming, emotionally agile, and very good at moving through rooms where meaning was often half sincerity and half performance. When I met her, I admired that. I was steadier, more inward, less fluent in the light social improvisations that some people wear so naturally you forget they are also a kind of craft. She seemed vivid in ways I was not trying to be. I seemed stable in ways she said made her feel safe. In the beginning that looked like balance, and for a while it was. I do not insult the truth by pretending the marriage had always been false. It was not. There was real love in it. Real kindness too. We built a home, survived difficult years, cared for each other through illness, raised children, and carried enough ordinary burdens together that our bond felt, to me, more serious than the mood of any one season. That matters because I do not want to narrate myself as a victim who was blind to obvious deception from the first moment. I was not blind. I was invested in an earlier truth longer than I should have been. There is a difference. People who have never built a real life with someone often imagine betrayal is shocking because you failed to notice signs. It is often worse than that. You notice signs. You just keep trying to interpret them in a way that preserves the dignity of what existed before. If I am going to tell this honestly, I should admit something unflattering about myself early. I took too much private pride in being reliable. Not boastfully. Quietly. The kind of masculine pride that hides inside usefulness and tells itself it is humility. I handled the taxes, the insurance, the home repairs, the college funds, the emergency reserve, the retirement transfers, the scheduling of all the quiet necessities that prevent a family from becoming a string of preventable emergencies. I did it because I was good at it and because somebody needed to. But usefulness, if offered consistently enough, begins disappearing into the background of other people's lives. They stop seeing the labor. They start experiencing the result as atmosphere. If they are careless enough, they eventually begin interpreting the person who provides that stability as less alive than the people who simply benefit from it. Celia used to call me grounding. Later she called me safe. Much later, the word shifted into a more polished kind of dismissal. I became predictable, structured, a little too attached to order. Those words sound small, but they matter because contempt rarely begins with direct insult. It begins with reclassification. Once one partner starts regarding the other's steadiness as a limitation rather than a gift, the marriage is already sliding into a dangerous hierarchy. The person who wants intensity begins treating the person who provides continuity as spiritually smaller. That is the kind of mistake people only recognize after they have built too much of themselves on it. The first serious fracture in our marriage was not another man. It was atmosphere. Celia's emotional life began carrying more moral importance than mine. If she felt restless, that was meaningful. If I felt uneasy, I was overreading. If she needed room, that was healthy. If I needed directness, that was pressure. She became more inconsistent in ways that were hard to describe without sounding paranoid if you only listed them one by one. Some nights she was warmer than usual, almost overly attentive, as if compensating for a private withdrawal. Other nights she was there in body and absent in every other useful sense. Her phone had a different gravity. Her language around work became vaguer exactly where it had once been naturally detailed. None of that alone was enough to justify confrontation. That is the difficulty of adult betrayal. It often arrives dressed in just enough plausibility to make the decent person keep waiting for something cleaner. The first time she said she needed me to stay calm, it sounded almost reasonable. We were in the kitchen late on a Thursday. Our son was upstairs. I had asked, carefully I thought, why a donor dinner had somehow run until nearly midnight when the event itself ended at 9 according to the foundation calendar she had once shown me. She looked at me for a long moment, then exhaled and said, "Thomas, I need you to stay calm when we talk about things." That line matters because it was the beginning of a certain kind of power play. Not open dominance. More subtle than that. She was not asking for calm in the ordinary sense. She was pre-framing my response before the truth entered the room, so that anything stronger than mild discomfort could later be treated as proof that I was the unstable variable. Calm, in her mouth, was not a shared value. It was a condition she was trying to impose on my right to react. I said, "That depends on what we're talking about." She said she had been feeling emotionally disconnected for a long time, that she was overwhelmed, that she needed me not to make every question feel like an interrogation. She said she felt watched. That line stung not because I believed it fully, but because conscientious men are especially vulnerable to accusations adjacent to their strengths. I do pay attention. I do notice patterns. I do care whether stories make sense. She took those traits and began repositioning them as evidence of emotional control. I still remember apologizing for the tone of my question, which embarrasses me now. Not because apologizing is weak. Because I apologized while she was already learning that my conscience could be used as cover. I should have understood then that the conversation was not really about my tone. It was about her freedom of movement within ambiguity. Still, I did what I had done too many times by then. I remained patient, hoping the right amount of steadiness would create room for honesty to enter. That was my error. I kept assuming honesty still held equal value for both of us. The other man entered the story gradually enough that I could still pretend, at first, that he was only a work orbit. His name was Andrew. He was a consultant tied to one of Celia's donor development initiatives, older than her by several years, the kind of man who looked composed enough that other people did much of the admiring for him. I met him once at a gallery fundraiser. He was not overtly charming. He was worse than that. He understood how to seem measured. Men like that often read as deeper than they are because they let the other person supply the significance. Celia described him afterward as surprisingly thoughtful, which was a phrase she reserved for people she was already assigning more emotional importance to than she wanted to admit. I noticed the name before I admitted the pattern. More mentions. More post-event debriefs. More references to what Andrew thought about this donor, that campaign, her ideas, her instincts. Then came the usual modern camouflage. He just gets where I'm coming from professionally. He's one of the only people who actually listens without trying to fix everything. That last line was especially revealing because it converted one of my best qualities into a criticism. I do solve things. Quietly, consistently. Often before anyone else notices they needed solving. In Celia's new value system, that practical steadiness had become emotionally inferior to a man whose only contribution, as far as I could see then, was attentive ambiguity. I noticed changes in myself too, and I should be honest about them. I became more careful than was healthy. More interpretive. More self-correcting. I did not want to become a suspicious husband, because suspicious husbands are easy to caricature, and I did not want to be unfair to a woman I had loved long enough to owe the truth more than fear. That is the danger of decency in the wrong environment. It slows you down while the liar keeps moving. The real break came through our son. Children notice asymmetry before adults want to admit it. Not because they understand affairs in the grown-up sense. Because they feel emotional migration. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the garage sorting extension cords and pretending to be interested in tools because I needed someplace in the house that did not feel emotionally edited, when my son walked in looking for a basketball pump. He asked whether his mother was at another work dinner. I said yes. He shrugged and said, "She seems happier when she's leaving than when she comes back." Then he found the pump and left. That sentence did more damage than a hotel receipt might have done in that moment. Because it told me the lie was already big enough to alter the weather of the home. This was no longer only between two adults and their private confusions. The emotional center of the house had shifted enough that a teenager could feel it in the doorway. I did not ask him more. Children should not be asked to become witnesses to their parents' failures. But I stopped helping Celia by doubting my own perception after that. The actual proof came through a shared cloud drive and one careless act of digital management. We kept most family documents in one system because I handled taxes, tuition, insurance, and other administrative duties. One Sunday morning, while searching for a medical reimbursement statement, I found a subfolder that had been misfiled during a sync conflict. Inside, it was an itinerary confirmation for a 2-night stay at a boutique hotel in Asheville. The reservation was under Celia's name. The secondary contact was Andrew's work email. The dates matched a weekend she had described as a donor strategy retreat with a women's planning group. That would have been enough. But there were also photos. Not explicit. Worse, in a way. Photos that showed emotional and physical proximity so clearly that her later language would look not only dishonest but insulting. A rooftop dinner. His hand on her back. The two of them reflected in an elevator mirror. One image of them on a balcony at night, wine glasses in hand, leaning toward each other with the kind of ease that belongs not to professional support or emotional connection, but to chosen intimacy. And then one unmistakable photo, them kissing in the dark window of a hotel hallway, caught in reflection, unaware of their own evidence. I stared at those photos for a long time. What struck me first was not rage. It was scale. She had not simply lied. She had decided how much of the truth I was allowed to live with while still relying on me to provide the stability of the life she was privately stepping out of. I met with an attorney before I confronted her. That mattered, because I had finally begun to understand that the first conversation after truth arrives can determine who keeps control over meaning. My attorney, a woman named Laura Keene, listened to the timeline, the messages, the photos, and the earlier conversations in which Celia had repeatedly asked me to stay calm. Then she said something that clarified everything. She did not want you calm, Laura said. She wanted you manageable. That was the exact word. Manageable. Celia did not want mutual emotional order. She wanted a version of my composure that prevented me from interrupting the pace at which she could betray me while still calling herself complicated rather than dishonest. That is what her request for calm had always meant. Not respect. Manageability. Once I understood that, my silence changed character. It stopped being passive and became deliberate. I did not confront her the same night I found the photos. I did not ask more questions designed to invite smaller lies. I stopped explaining the emotional impact of things she already understood perfectly well. I remained present for my son. I paid the bills. I made dinner. I kept the house from collapsing into visible warfare. But I withdrew the thing she had been using most effectively against me: my willingness to keep translating my pain into language she could edit. She noticed almost immediately. One evening, while unloading groceries, she said, "You've become really shut down lately." I said, "No. I've just stopped giving you reactions you can organize." That landed because it named the mechanism. We were no longer arguing about whether there was a problem. We were facing the fact that she had been depending on my decency to preserve control over when and how the full truth emerged. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. She came home around 8, set her bag on the entry table, and found me sitting in the den with a folder laid out in front of me. No dramatic posture. No yelling. No performance. Just the house. Finally done with euphemism. She looked at the folder and said, "What's this?" I said, "The part you asked me to stay calm for." Her face changed almost instantly. Not guilt first. Fear of losing authorship. I opened the folder. The photos. The reservation. The timeline. The account charges. The draft petition. And because it mattered just as much to me, notes from prior conversations where she had told me it was unfair to ask certain questions, where she had framed directness as aggression, where she had insisted I needed to remain calm as though calm were the same thing as ignorance. The first thing she said was not, "I'm sorry." It was, "You went through my files?" That told me everything. Even then, the offense in her mind was still my access to reality rather than her betrayal. I said, "No. I stopped living inside the version of reality you chose for me." Then came the sequence. It started emotionally. She had been lonely. She had felt unseen. Andrew understood parts of her she had buried for years. She didn't want to hurt me. It wasn't supposed to become this physical. That line almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was such a perfect example of scale management. Even with the photos in front of us, she was still trying to narrate the affair as something that had happened to her rather than something she had built. I asked her one question. "When you asked me to stay calm, was that about respect, or was it about making sure I didn't interrupt your version of the story?" That was the moment the truth was fully revealed. Not that she had another man. Not that she had lied about the nature of the relationship. The deeper truth was that she had counted on my temperament as part of the affair's infrastructure. She assumed I would remain controlled enough to keep the house functioning, to keep the children protected, to keep the conflict emotionally orderly, while she managed the pace at which reality arrived. In other words, she mistook my character for something she had the right to use. I think that offended me more deeply than the kiss itself. The divorce that followed was not dramatic. Most real endings are not. They are administrative, expensive, painful in the slow, ordinary way adulthood often is painful. Accounts. Schedules. Property division. Our son learning, too early, that grown people often use emotionally intelligent language when they are trying hardest to avoid plain truth. Andrew faded quickly once the affair lost the contrast that had made him feel meaningful. That did not surprise me. Secondary relationships often look profound because they exist in relief against an established life someone else is still maintaining. What stayed with me longer was the phrase itself. Stay calm. I thought about it often. About how people use emotional language not to deepen honesty but to manage the other person's access to it. Calm. Safety. Space. Regulation. Complexity. Growth. All real words. All useful when spoken truthfully. All dangerous when used by someone who is trying to preserve moral control over a reality they have already broken. A year later, while we were standing outside our son's school after a meeting about college planning, Celia said quietly, "I really did think staying calm would have helped." I looked at her and said, "No. You thought staying calm would have helped you." There was nothing else to add. If there is anything worth understanding from what happened to me, it is this. When someone asks you to stay calm before they tell you something difficult, Pay attention to whether they are asking for emotional dignity or emotional control. The difference matters. One is respect. The other is management. And if the person asking is already betraying you, then calm may simply mean please remain organized enough that I do not have to face the full force of what I've done. That does not work forever. Eventually, the truth becomes too large for the language built to contain it. And when that happens, the calmest thing a man can do is stop helping the lie stay small.